Good afternoon, everybody. This session is going to be very special and energetic for various reasons. Number one, I believe all of you had very sumptuous food. Number two, I'm quite sure and I can assure you Mr. Amar Sinha is a very pleasant personality with 35 years of experience as a diplomat and most of the interesting places across the globe. He has been posted. He has also worked for 3 years as ambassador in Afghanistan. So he has a very primary information at the core inputs out of his own experience. He's very articulate. We are touching upon a topic which is of great interest to all of us. We are talking in terms of new epicenter of terror, shifting from place A to place B. And all of us, I'm quite sure, have some input or the other in an interest. So I'm quite sure that in the question and answer session, we'll have a very lively discussion where the experience and the knowledge of Mr. Amar Sinha will be not only a good food for thought, but we'll be taking certain narratives to relish later on also. With that, I invite Mr. Amar Sinha for his keynote. Thank you.
Namaskar. Can you hear me? Let me, at the outset, thank India Foundation for this opportunity to speak at the 4th CTC, and also make a confession that since I have been ambassador in Afghanistan, I do have a special weakness. So what I will say will definitely have an Indian flavor, but it will also reflect the Afghan point of view in many ways. Having said that, let me say that the hypothesis that AFPAC is the epicenter of terror has been so deeply researched, documented, and written about that there is very little that I can really add in trying to prove that point. So I'm quite tempted to use a Latin phrase we used in school in maths, QED, quod erat demonstrandum, which basically means it is proven what we started to prove. Having said that, I would still like to make 2 points. That the retreat of IS from Iraq and Syria, there is a likelihood of a large number of global jihadists and free-floating radicalized mercenaries to gravitate towards this region. We have seen signs of a fledgling Islamic State of Khorasan, which also has both a historical and a philosophical allure that they will come. The question is, will their entry be facilitated as it was in Syria? And the second is, of course, a purely Afghan perspective. When we talk of stabilizing Afghanistan or having policies for of ensuring that Afghanistan is not a theater of violence, it is wonderful to say it's an AFPAC problem. But when we have to focus on terror, I think there is a need to dehyphenate. And the focus only needs to be on Pakistan and not AFPAC, because Afghanistan is a victim of terror. It is a theater where the terrorists bred, trained, and equipped in Pakistan are getting unleashed, and it is challenging the international community. And Afghanistan, I can tell you, neither has the wherewithal nor the desire to become a center where it would both breed and export terror outside. They have enough problems of their own. Why then does Pakistan follow this policy? This is a question that should arise. Now, there are several reasons. We will really have to go back to history, but let's start with our partition. I think the partition of the subcontinent and its ambition in terms of territory, both towards the east on Jammu and Kashmir, and also, I fear, towards its west, because Pakistan was also very fearful of the Durand Line, which Ambassador Dogra will be talking about on the west, which cuts through the Pashtun heartland, led to the birth of the largest Islamic nation, which also became a nuclear weapon state later. But this itself gave it a sense of entitlement, both in terms of a parity with India, a different world vision, and more importantly, an ambition to be the leader of the Islamic Ummah. And of course, that has pitted it against India's multi-religious society, and this is a problem which is going to persist way beyond Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir problem, I am afraid. Pakistan is also driven, or its policies are driven by this terrible fear of Afghanistan and India joining hands because of what I said. Military being the only savior of this holy land has found resonance among the people, and that is why this policy has been continued for so long. Of course, because of the disparities in size, they have relied on asymmetric warfare and an undeclared war, both on its borders, east and west. But the problem is that the ideology that has been infused in this Mujahideen is a challenge and a threat, not only to the region, but to global peace all across the world. While, of course, use of irregulars and tribals predates the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. We saw it in 1948. However, 79 was a turning point in a way that it legitimized use of jihad and use of violence and religion against the non-believers and also believers which were apostates. So thus these two key elements of jihad and takfiri are the ones which you would have heard in the morning session are the key drivers which have continued this policy so long. Of course, Pakistan, because USSR retreated from Afghanistan, has also created a false narrative which actually feeds this Taliban insistence on continuing the war, that we actually defeated a superpower and we can perhaps take on the next one. I personally feel that this narrative is overblown, exaggerated, because the thing and the geopolitics has changed, and also the stormtroopers of that period have changed. If you look at it, all the Mujahideen forces which Pakistan supported against Soviet Union are now back in Afghanistan, including Hekmatyar. In fact, all of them are part of the national government today. They have completely divorced themselves from this ideology, except for Taliban. So I don't know whether they can repeat the same strategy again. Besides, the two main supporters of that Mujahideen, or this fight against the infidel Soviets, the Saudis and the US are no longer on the same page. In fact, they are perhaps on opposite sides today. So I don't know whether this narrative also needs to be questioned and questioned publicly. Of course, while there is this push factor, there is a pull factor, and I must confess that there are weaknesses in the Afghan society and governance. You heard Nabil Sahib yesterday. There are issues of ethnic divisions, corruption, lack of political cohesion, questionable elections, stagnant economic growth, and a flourishing criminal economy based on narco trade and illegal mining, kidnapping and blackmail, which has all, and these are the domestic factors which have sustained both the Taliban operations and also the small criminal groups which operate under the banner of Taliban in different parts of Afghanistan. I fear that as we enter the election years, parliamentary elections this year and presidential elections next year in Afghanistan, there would be greater efforts at destabilization. And of course, we have seen that the Shia-Sunni fault lines are now being increasingly used. And a number of Shia mosques have been attacked in Afghanistan, which was never the case. Afghanistan had its own brand of Islam, which perhaps corresponded more to the Sufi tradition, which was moderate, but that is sought to be changed through this radicalization. Of course, a weak, disunited government, which is in disarray, helps the people who don't want a stable and strong Afghanistan. And that is why, and that is what is critical in India's interest, that we should have a strong Afghanistan which is governed centrally from Kabul, so that Pakistan does not get access to ungoverned areas where it could locate these training camps as in the pre-2001 era, because that provides it deniability and respectability when its hands gets exposed outside or it gets questioned. In fact, Pakistan after 2001 continued for nearly 10 years, completely denying existence of Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, till one was located in Abbottabad and the other died in Karachi hospital. And once that has been exposed, one sees a certain brazenness in Pakistani public perceptions. In fact, if you have followed Pervez Musharraf, who ruled during that regime, he very proudly now boasts on television channels of how useful that has been as a tool for regional influence, both in India and both in Afghanistan, and of course for troubling and bleeding India. What next? President Ghani, in a very bold move, has offered Pakistan, the Taliban, unconditional talks. He has invited them even to open an office in Kabul. Now, the responses that you see from Taliban, of course, the responses came in 3 stages. First was an open letter to the US public, which was trying to drive a division, or obviously very keenly observing the American debate and the fatigue on this long war. They appealed to the American public that this is a war that you cannot win, so it is best to accommodate us. Second, that they responded to Mr. Barney Rubin, and I must say that Taliban leaders have learned very good English in the last 15 or 20 years that they had lived in Pakistan, and the letter came within 1 day of Barney Rubin's letter. But the 2 conditions now that they have put to Afghan government, I don't think will be accepted, which is 100% withdrawal of foreign troops and a 50% power sharing in entire country. Now, you have to understand how the Afghan political system works today. After the last 2014 elections, there is already a 50-50 power sharing between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, and it's called the National Unity Government. So we are seeing a demand that Taliban wants to form a national unity government with the national unity government, which is already there, which has been elected democratically. So perhaps it is an opening gambit and maximalist demand, but I feel that opening of a Taliban office in Kabul may or may not be acceptable to the Pakistani handlers, because they will lose the control that they have on them today. But then how do we deal with Pakistan? And keeping aside Jammu and Kashmir, first thing that we all have to do is to reject their victim narrative. In fact, it is undeniable that the Pakistani society has paid a heavy price in terms of human losses. But the fact is that if the military regime argues that they are one of the bigger victims of terror, I think it is not only a shameful denial, but it's also disingenuous, because it is nothing but a reflection of their own policies that they have followed since '79. Of course, there would be efforts to put pressure on the global stage. We have seen in the last 1.5 years several such efforts. SARC summit was not held. Then perhaps the biggest snub to Pakistan was the Islamic summit in Saudi Arabia, which was organized by Mohammed bin Salman and President Trump, when Nawaz Sharif, who reached Riyadh rehearsing his speech, was not even called to make a statement at an Islamic summit. And And that was a major setback because it sees itself as a leader. It is the second largest in terms of population, plus a nuclear weapon state to boot, that he was not allowed to speak at that forum. Then, for the first time, BRICS declaration of last year, if you notice, that one paragraph was devoted, and the first time Pakistan-based terrorist organizations, which are also India-focused, were mentioned. And this was a big development as far as their permanent support from China is concerned. Iran, one of their neighbors, Iran has publicly threatened that they are willing to take action in Pakistani territory to neutralize the training camps in Balochistan. Now that's a big message. If you have three neighbors and all three of them have such a grievance against you, then there's something that Pakistan needs to introspect. Then, of course, US President's famous tweet of 3rd of January, or was it 2nd of January, about that Pakistan has only given lies and deceit as being a non-NATO ally was another wake-up call. Then their isolation at the Financial Action Task Force recently, where only Turkey stood with them till the end, and even China and Saudi Arabia actually sort of moved away from shielding it from the threat of censure. And I choose my words carefully because it is not yet put on a blacklist, and perhaps it may not even have an effect because Pakistan was on this gray list from 2012 to 2015, and it did not change its behavior. But the fact is that in today's world, when it is looking at greater economic development and investments, this is a major setback. And of course, but the fear is that the regional consensus against Taliban seems to be fractured today. There was a time when Russia, China, India were singing from the same hymn sheet. Today, it is not so. Now, whether this sort of a policy of Russia and China or divergence from the regional consensus will continue, despite evidence that it is Pakistan from where the terror groups that threaten them also operate or they find shelter in, when they realize that there is no distinction between state and non-state actors when it comes to Pakistan and the terror groups, I am not sure. We hope it will change. China is a particularly important actor in this, not only because it is a very close friend, but also because it has huge plans of investments of over $50 billion in CPEC. And none of these plans will fructify if Pakistan is overrun by over 80 terrorists that they have listed which operate in Pakistan, are given a free rein. So they will have to be checked. Now, whether China will be able to do that, I am not sure yet. But the fact is that China itself has an Islamist problem in Xinjiang, and that also would guide its own policies towards this region. On top of this, we see that there's a new narrative which is emerging, which is of Daesh. As Engineer Nabil yesterday mentioned, that they have not located Daesh in terms of people who have moved away from Iraq or Syria. These are all local guys. These are primarily, when it started in 2014, 2015, there was evidence that these were all from a particular tribe called Orakzai, which were also the backbone of TTP. And there were evidence collected by both NDS and the civil society in Afghanistan, which showed that it had some linkages with Pakistan. Perhaps it will take another Carlota Gall and Christine Fair another 10 years to discover these links. It may take 10 years, but we may find that it has perhaps a new chapter in the same book where we have seen that Pakistan has changed horses mid-course from the Mujahideen to Hekmatyar, then from Hekmatyar to Taliban, and perhaps Daesh is the new incarnation because it creates a distance. The linkages with Taliban have been exposed. So it creates a distance if you can create a new phenomena called Daesh. First, it becomes global. You get on board Russia and China to start looking at Taliban in a more indulgent manner, because it's the old simple saying, if you have to make a line small, what do? You can either rub it off or draw a bigger line next to it, and that is perhaps what is happening. I don't have concrete evidence, but there are signs that this could be the reason. But, and when I say that Pakistan military, and I think the messages from the domestic developments are going back to it. They have a restive Balochistan. They have, of course, Sindh is not particularly happy. And this long Pashtun march is perhaps the greatest uprising you have seen. Some people call it the Pashtun Spring. We don't know. But the street chant that they used really captures the essence of what is behind this epicenter. And the street chant was in Urdu, "Ye jo dahshat gardi hai, iske piche vardi hai." And that is absolutely on the dot. It is the popular wisdom which has been captured. But besides that, what we need to do is to understand that what is the force which drives the political domestic agenda. And there, in fact, I must quote a very famous columnist, which in an op-ed wrote, and of course he's describing the ISI, but he calls it the masters of the dark art of invisible politics. Of course, I think that is the best he could do in terms of naming it. But one of the policy objectives, if we want to have some semblance of sanity, would be to rebalance the domestic institutions, where one institution seems to be overwhelming all the other, which is preventing Pakistan from having a normal life. So I'll stop here. I'll take questions, and you have a very interesting panel following me, including Christine Fair and Ambassador Dogra, to carry on this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. I'm quite sure there will be lots of questions from the audience. And just sir, I'll be coming to you, sir. I must compliment you for making a very lucid presentation on the subject, and really speaks of your experience. And I think still a couple of contradictions and inconsistencies which have emerged over a period of time. I'm quite sure from the audience there will be very lively questions. Now, may I invite with Mr. Dogra, please?
It is generally said that Pakistan wants to have control over Afghanistan because of its strategic depth. It wants to have strategic depth vis-a-vis India. Maybe because of sometime military pressure from India. Does it mean they want to hide their assets in Afghanistan? Does it make any sense because in the drone attacks, Americans sitting thousands of miles away can target anyone in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or anywhere in Pakistan. So just it wants a client state, or it wants to open up to the Central Asian Republic also through Afghanistan.
Mr. Sinha will take 2-3 questions and then like to respond. We take the second question now.
My name is Kamaljeet. I am a journalist. My question is, will Abdullah has agreed to power sharing with Taliban, or will he agree with power sharing with Taliban, and why, if whatever the answer is?
Thank you. Any other? Yes, from there.
The facts on ground, whatever they are, as policy makers, why has India allowed Pakistan to open more than 2 fronts for last more than 40 years? In spite of resources being on our side, Pakistan being less than 1/10 of our size, coming out of us. And where are we heading, except for last few statements by US President? When US questions Pakistan, we have got China floodgates open for them. So have we faltered over a period of time? Have we been offensive or to some extent by nature defensive? And why the situation is so fluid in AFPAC region with the role of Pakistan?
Will you please explain your question? What are the 2 fronts he wants to know? He's not clear. Yeah.
What I'm saying, with more than 40 years, Pakistan following the policy towards west as well as towards east. What have we, why have we allowed, why and how, and have we allowed this situation to develop to this extent?
Yeah, request Mr. Sinha to answer these three questions, then we can take more if the time permitting.
So the question of strategic depth, let me take that first. Of course, personally, I believe that all these ideas of buffer zones and strategic depth are theories that have outlived its life. In today's world, with different types of weaponry, you don't need strategic depth. And in any case, strategic depth, as Pakistan sees it, I see it as a defeatist policy. You need buffer zones in front of you. You don't need strategic depth and buffer zones behind your borders. The fact that it wants to control Afghanistan is absolutely true. It needs both access to Central Asia, which has been denied because they have denied access to India to Afghanistan. And that is why their Afghanistan-Pakistan trade agreement has not been extended. And they have been negotiated since 2015. And there's no resolution because Afghanistan has made it a precondition that any opening northwards will only happen if they get equal access to India. In terms of, I suspect that they also have territorial ambitions in Afghanistan, maybe to compensate them for the loss of Bangladesh. I don't know. Nobody has spelt out, but perhaps that is at the back of their mind. About Dr. Abdullah agreeing, I think all political leadership will agree to an eventual peace settlement, which is within the framework of the Afghan constitution. But it is not about one individual agreeing, it's about the entire Jamiat party and the other leadership. I don't think Pakistan is only governed by these two people, Ghani and Abdullah. But the people will accept it. Because you see, if you look at the Taliban record with over 5,000 civilians getting killed each year, I think there's a public rejection. In fact, last poll I saw that there was sympathy for Taliban ideology only in 5 or 10% of the people. Half the time, it is because of fear that they acquiesce in Taliban overrunning their villages. But there is very little appetite for that among the people. And the situation has changed. So it is not only Abdullah, or it depends on one man's veto. This will be a consultative process. I'm sure there is this traditional Loya Jirga which happens in Afghanistan where every 3,000 people get together, leadership of all, and that is the highest decision-making body recognized even in their own constitution. So I think it will be something at that level it will have to be taken a call on. Pakistan opening two fronts, well, Pakistanis sees that Indians have opened two fronts. Well, that is the problem, how we look at it. Why we have, obviously, I don't think Indian policymakers have ever thought of treating Afghanistan as a launch pad for action against Pakistan. Now, if we actually did that, we will be feeding into this Pakistan narrative that India and Afghanistan together are doing a pincer movement, and which they use to justify their own policies. So I don't think we should even think of using it as a second front. Well, they have overstretched themselves. There are various reasons. They are raising funds from the narco-terrorism. They're diverting international aid that comes to them. And they have been able to manage. And that is why they have relied on terrorism, because it is the cheaper cost action. It will be easier to deal with Pakistan if it actually had a declared war and there was a showdown between the militaries. That doesn't happen.
Thank you very much, sir. And I'm constrained to take more questions, as we are told that the next session is due to start shortly. So I thank Mr. Amar Sinha for his narratives, which is for his elaboration on the subject, and thank all the audience being here. The history is the example that people have been counter-attacked by their own monsters, which they have created for others. And I'll end up this session, the same thoughts have been explained by a shair, by a poet. Mera ghar jalane wale, mere ghar ke baad hogi, tere ghar ki bhi tabahi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Sinha and Dr. Maheshwari, for the lively session. I would request Dr. A.P. Maheshwari to kindly felicitate Ambassador Amar Sinha. I would request Prabha Rao ma'am to kindly felicitate Dr. A.P. Maheshwari. Thank you, sirs. I would request everyone to kindly remain seated. We'll immediately start a plenary session on the AFPAC region as epicenter of global terror. Please note a change in the schedule. Raksha Mantri Nirmala Sitharaman ji would be delivering the dinner address at 7:15 p.m. Please be present for the same. I would request Ambassador Rajiv Dogra to kindly come on stage. Ambassador Rajiv Dogra is a former diplomat and author of the book Where Borders Bleed, regarded as one of the most authoritative books on the India-Pak relations. The speakers for the session are Habil Christian Wagner. Mr. Wagner is a senior fellow from German Institute of International and Security Affairs. Mr. Wagner, if you can please come on stage. C. Christine Fair. Christine Fair is an associate professor at Georgetown University, US. She's a political scientist. Ma'am, if you can please come on stage. Abu Samad Khaidarov. Mr. Abu Samad Khaidarov is a former ambassador of Uzbekistan. So if you can please come on stage. And Mr. Frederick Grar, who is charged a mission of Asia Bureau, Director for Strategic Affairs, Ministry of Defense, France. So if you can please come on stage. Please give the panel a loud round of applause. Over to Ambassador Dogra.
Hello. Ram Madhav ji and everyone associated with India Foundation, congratulations on the 4th annual session on a very important subject, and congratulations for organizing it so well that people from all over the world are coming to discuss this issue which refuses to go away. But my problem is that after Ambassador Amar Sinha, in his address, has covered almost everything that could be said on the subject of AFPAC, what do we do? But to help me, I have some of the most distinguished voices, and I'm glad for the choice India Foundation has made, because France, Germany, Uzbekistan, and USA, each one of them with vast, unfortunately vast experience of dealing with terrorism, is represented here. Let me start by picking on a couple of things, one or two from Ambassador Sinha's address. But before I do that, let me also compliment, and yet another compliment to India Foundation, that they've selected Gurugram as the venue for the conference. And I hope that Guru Dronacharya up there, who had all the wisdom in fighting wars and finding solutions to warfare, has some inspiration for us in terms of tackling terror. So this is a good choice of a venue. Ambassador Sinha had talked about why AFPAC. Indeed, that was the issue that I had in my mind as I was coming here. The message is very clear that AFPAC, this region, is the epicenter of terror. In the American designation of 98 terrorist organizations worldwide, 20 are to be found in this region, and that's the highest concentration anywhere. But at the same time, there is also the other question that can we equate the accused and the defendant in the same sentence, in the same term? Pakistan is the perpetrator. Afghanistan is the victim. So should we hyphenate them or should we de-hyphenate them, as Pakistan had wanted when in 2008 the term was first used by US, by President Obama's administration. In a way, the message that would come out of de-hyphenating may be useful for the world at large. But if we de-hyphenate and restrict ourselves to a smaller area, and I'm referring here to the two sides across the Durand line, because in my view, the issue of terrorism really started when Durand line was drawn in 1893. Pashtuns were divided, and ever since they have been restive. In fact, soon after that, in 1897, Amir Abdur Rahman called all the tribal chiefs to Kabul, gave them arms and finances to start a jihad against the British. And that jihad has not died down ever since, whether it is Pakistan or in some cases US itself, which was inciting the Pashtuns. But Pashtuns, rather than Pakistanis in general, have been the greatest victims of terror. When Pakistan says 60,000 or 70,000 are victims of terror, what they are really referring to is Pashtuns of the area. Some say 50,000, some say 60,000, who have perished fighting terror or being part of the terror machine sponsored by Pakistan. The second corollary of the same thing is the long march which Ambassador Sinha had referred to, the Pashtun Long March. There's a new phenomena which is emerging from this Pashtun Long March, that the Pakistani Pathans are not using Pathan anymore to describe themselves. It's not Pathan Long March. It is Pashtun Long March. In some cases, even Pakhtun Long March, which identifies them more with people, the Pashtuns, from the Afghanistan side of the Pashtun area. So the point I'm making is whether this Durand line is the cause of all the problems associated with terror? Will rubbing out of the Durand line make terror disappear? It's just a thought, but I thought I must provoke you. Before I go any further, and I think I'll have many opportunities to do that, let me mention that the way we are going to proceed is to have 10 minutes each from each panelist. I will be introducing each one of them. And then at the end of their presentation, the floor will be open for question-answer session. And I'm sure the question-answer session should be as interesting and as provocative as the address by the panelists themselves. So without going any further, let me start with Mr. Nabil Christian Wagner. He has been known in the academic circles for all the research that he has done. Unfortunately, most of your papers were in German, so I couldn't read much, but whatever I could was very impressive. And he has a vast experience of scholarship on the region itself. So over to you, Mr. Wagner.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Doga. Namaskar, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I think it's a special challenge that we are facing in this panel, because I think we will have a very great consensus on the topic. So the challenge will be whether we will find some good points to have a more controversial debate. I think we all agree that we have seen various changes in international terrorism, but first and foremost, we have also seen many successes in recent years. Al-Qaeda, which was the most evident threat, was followed by the creation of the Caliphate and the Islamic State in the Middle East in 2014. In recent years, we have seen various concentrated efforts by the international community in the political, economic, and military field to fight the international terrorist groups, and many states have supported national governments in their fight against these groups. We have seen new regulations against terror financing, and we have also seen new sanctions against states and individuals. Because of the efforts on the different levels, the number of Al-Qaeda attacks have come down, and the territorial control of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq was eliminated last year. Nevertheless, the threat of global terrorism is not over, but it has shifted its focus. So we are facing new challenges. For instance, first, will the Islamic State be able to survive in other countries? The Islamic Caliphate may no longer be existent, but there are still IS branches operating in different countries. Second, countries, especially in Western Europe, are confronted with the return of foreign IS fighters to their home countries. And so far, it's not really clear in how far they will continue their struggle there, and in how far they can be legally prosecuted. Finally, the ideological attraction of Islamic extremism is still high, as we have discussed in the morning, and new forms of radicalization, especially over social media, are difficult to be controlled, especially in open democratic societies. Let me come in my first of my 2 points on the global terrorism and its impact on South Asia. It's interesting to see that South Asia and Western European countries have suffered very different under global terrorist groups, if we refer to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State as the two proponents. Since 9/11, Al-Qaeda was the most important global terrorist organization which has conducted attacks on different continents, as we have witnessed. In 2014, Al-Qaeda set up also a regional branch, the Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, as an umbrella organization. The group has also focused especially on India. It has declared war on India and its activities in Bangladesh and in Jammu and Kashmir. But despite its propaganda, it's interesting to see that Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent has found relatively little resonance amongst the Muslim community in India. Local Al-Qaeda groups in Kashmir have never been very successful, and so far there has been no noteworthy attacks in India which could be attributed to this group. A similar development can be seen with regard to the Islamic State, which also had a clear global agenda, mostly targeting Western countries. Western European countries have sent much higher figures of foreign fighters to IS. The estimates for Germany alone are around 900 to 1,000 fighters from Germany who have joined IS in recent years. With the creation of the Khorasan province, which included large parts of South and Central Asia, the Islamic State has also found its way to South Asia. In Afghanistan, it was able to establish its own networks, especially in cooperation with the local militant groups who split from the Taliban. It could also link up with local militant groups both in Pakistan and Bangladesh. In India, the number of supporters for IS have been relatively small, and so far there has been only one attack which could be attributed to the Islamic State in India. The interesting point is also that IS followers in South Asia, especially in India and Bangladesh, mostly have a middle-class background, which differs very much from the social profile of IS fighters from European countries. Of course, India may have not experienced attacks from Al-Qaeda or IS specifically, but of course it's confronted since many years with attacks from groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. They also had an international orientation, also it is much more limited compared to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Moreover, it should not be overlooked that the three different organizations, Al-Qaeda, Islamic States, and LET, follow different ideological traditions in Islam. So this is also the reason why you had a rivalry among these groups, and we have also witnessed armed clashes among these groups, for instance, in Afghanistan between the Taliban and the Islamic State. When we focus now in the second part on the changing dynamics in the AFPAC theater, I think I will have a very similar view like the previous speakers. Generally, it should not be forgotten that Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan still belong to the top 10 of the most affected countries of international terrorism, according to the Global Terrorism Index. So despite all the successes, we should not forget that the region is still plagued by different forms of militancy, which pose a threat to all countries and the societies. But we have also seen that the AFPAC region remains one of the epicenter of global terrorism. Afghanistan is one of the places where the Islamic State has probably the largest number of fighters in the subcontinent, plus you still have Al-Qaeda groups operating and the Taliban. But we have also seen in the second transformation that the new South Asia policy of the Trump administration, as well as the efforts of the international community recently against the financing in the financial task force against Pakistan, have shifted the focus more on Afghanistan. When we look at Afghanistan, and we have heard it yesterday by the former national security advisors, the security situation has deteriorated in recent months. The Islamic State could successfully use the frustration within the Taliban so that many former Taliban groups joined the IS after 2014. Moreover, the IS was also responsible for several attacks, especially on religious minority and the civil society, but as a reaction, the international community has also increased its military cooperation with Afghanistan and have stepped up the troops. The most difficult point, or the most difficult partner or country is of course, Pakistan. It should not be overlooked that the security situation in Pakistan has improved since 2015. This was largely a result of the military operations in the tribal areas in 2014. Nevertheless, so the IS was not able to successfully gain a stronger foothold in Pakistan. It could win the support among some of the Pakistani Taliban group, as well as some of the sectarian Sunni groups. So what is most important, I think, for the future debate is that we have seen some shifts going on also in Pakistan, which have mainly to do with the changes in the international system. So it was mainly the new South Asia policy of the Trump administration, which has a much clearer focus on Pakistan, which was followed by the financial sanctions of the Financial Action Task Force just last month. We also have seen some action by the Pakistani state to go against some of the militant groups and its leader. Already in January last year, Hafiz Saeed, the leader of Jamaat-ud-Dawa, was put under house arrest, and this decision was welcomed also by parts of the Pakistani establishment. We also have seen just in the beginning of this year that the Pakistani government has amended its Anti-Terrorism Act, which allowed to put further sanctions against proscribed groups from the UN terror list. The government has taken over several institutions from Jamaat-ud-Dawa and the Falah Insanat Foundation, and so far more than 140 properties of the two organizations seem to have been confiscated so far. But of course, we have also seen this before. The groups have been active to transfer some of their properties to individuals. Moreover, we have also seen that Hafiz Saeed and other leaders from the JUD are also using these institutions. We have also seen the recent attempts, and we have all heard we have also seen the recent attempts in Pakistan to bring the militant groups into the mainstream. Jamaat-ud-Dawa tried to set up its own political party, the Milli Muslim League, which is so far not a registered political party, but at least it could already achieve some success in the by-election in Lahore last year. So we will have to see in how far this strategy to mainstream the militants will be a useful tool in the long-term perspective, or in how far it will further increase extremist thinking in Pakistani society. It's also not clear what was the motivation or what are the motivation behind the establishment to follow this strategy, to bring the militants into the political mainstream, and in how far this strategy will be successful in the long term. Let me come to my final point. I think we have seen a certain shift in the bilateral or in the AFPAC equation so far. Previously, the focus has been much stronger on Afghanistan. Now I think with recent developments, we have seen that the focus has shifted on Pakistan, and it's a stronger effort by the international community to fight against the infrastructure of terrorism. Moreover, we should also not forget that we may also need some more regional cooperation in this attempt. The efforts by the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation have been not very successful, as we all know, but I think we have seen recent developments by India to promote new institutions like BIMSTEC to promote a closer security cooperation. I think at the end I would also highlight the role of Pakistan. We have not seen, the role of China in Pakistan. I think we have, as mentioned by Ambassador Sinha before, there has been massive Chinese investment in Pakistan, yes, but there is also an increase of Chinese citizens, which creates, of course, a great security concern for China as well as for Pakistan. So I think it will be interesting to see in how far China is going to change its policy towards Pakistan, and China's support for the sanctions in the financial task force against Pakistan may be a greater step for a better Chinese engagement with the international community so far. It will be interesting to see also in how far this is going to affect the long-term relationship between China and Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. That was a very comprehensive and very clinical presentation of the issue, as was only to be expected from you. As far as the next speaker is concerned, who doesn't know Christian Fair? But before I request her to speak, I want to share one thought with her. In 1958, President Eisenhower, he wondered why is it that the Arab world hates US. And the National Security Council of US then did a study and came back to him. And they said that there's a perception in the Arab world that we support dictatorships. Around the same time, US was busy making sure that President Ayub was a successful dictator. And that association, with some brief interruptions, has carried on ever since. Is it because of that AFPAC region is in some ways the epicenter of terror? Or are there more variations to that question? The second thought, which I wanted to leave with you, is that the day after 9/11, I happened to be in Tashkent, and the day after that in Dushanbe, where Ahmad Shah Massoud's body had arrived at Farkhor, the border, just a couple of days earlier. Now, in both the capitals, I met the leadership at the highest level. And naturally, the talk turned to 9/11 and what will happen. And in both the cases, subsequently in other capitals of Central Asia as well, they made one observation which surprisingly was the same theme everywhere, that US is going to hit at Afghanistan and will spare Pakistan. They followed it up by one more sentence. By doing this, they'll be trimming the branches, the roots of terror will prosper. Are they wrong? Ms. Christian Fair is an eminent writer and one of the very few who has had tremendous success in that excess in Pakistan, including with its army, if I'm not mistaken, and has written some wonderful books. Some of them have not been very liked in Pakistan. Some of them have been followed as a deep research material in South Asia, if not in other centers of the world, probably in other centers of the world also. Ms. Fair, the floor is yours, and please feel free. I'm sorry for that 10-minute restriction, but please feel free to talk as much as you wish. The audience is yours.
But I need a place to plug my computer in because it died. Is there an outlet? Thank you so much. Let me know when it's plugged in. I have to shut it back on. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to restart. Anyway, so I'm just going to, my notes are on my computer, and my computer died, so I may just have to wing it. All right, so there's a certain kind of boredom that I have in this topic because we say these things over and over again, and unfortunately, you know, nothing ever seems to change when it comes to Pakistan and US policy towards it, particularly in the post 9/11 period. What's up? All right, cool. So, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Nothing's going to change either under President Trump. He can tweet whatever he wants, and he will do that. But there is a very serious constraint to what he or any other US president wants to do in Afghanistan, and that's logistics. Any logisticians here from the military? Anyone? So, you know, we can obsess over the number of troops that we have in Afghanistan. We can obsess over what their mission is going to be. Is it going to be counterinsurgency? Is it going to be counterterrorism? But there'll be none of those missions if we don't have a way to logistically resupply our troops in Afghanistan. And, you know, for the last, how many years has it been? I think the global war on terrorism is old enough to drive now. For years, I have heard Indians say, why is the US giving Pakistan so much money, right? And I think right now we're up to something like $34 billion and counting. Well, and the reason's very simple. We need access to Afghanistan's access to Pakistan's ground lines of communication, and we need specifically access to Pakistan's airspace, or the air lines of communication, to sustain our presence and that of our partners in Afghanistan, right? This is overdetermined by this thing called a map. So we learned in 2011, when the Pakistanis closed down the GLOCs, that the northern distribution route is complete nonsense. And you can see why the northern distribution route is complete nonsense if you look at a map. We still need to have a port, and once things are offloaded at a port, they then have to be transported over land, back through another sea, back to land, and down through Afghanistan, and depending upon which route, traversing multiple countries. And these countries are largely influenced by Russia, and in case you haven't been paying attention, our relationship with Russia is actually pretty constrained. And one of the ports that would have been used in this northern distribution route is in Turkey. Our relations with Turkey are also not so fabulous. Now, had Hillary Clinton actually been the president, and actually she did win the popular vote, it was the slave state college that made the sexual assailant in chief that's presently occupying the White House, the president, we would have been able to capitalize upon the opening with Iran, right? And Indians know full well that, you know, India has invested quite a bit in Chabahar. India, in the last few months, recently demonstrated the efficacy of this alternative ground line of communication by moving several thousand tons of wheat into Afghanistan. But of course, Trump, and I won't use the preface president, what Trump has done, largely under the influence of Israel, has done everything it can to sabotage this Iran agreement. For whatever reason, Trump seems persuaded that Iran is more dangerous than Pakistan, even though all of the evidence would undermine that sort of assertion. And so this puts India, I think, in a really interesting space, because India has good relations with Iran. India has also very good relations with Israel. From my point of view, as an analyst of South Asia, I don't understand why we are carrying water for Israel. Israel has no troops in Afghanistan. Israel has nothing to do with the Afghan conflict. Yet we are pursuing a policy that undermines our own strategic interests for reasons that are not even clear to me, right? So this is, I think India has an important role to sort of interlocute about the importance of the JCPOA. Because I assure you, under Netanyahu's pressure, Trump is going to do everything he can to undo the JCPOA. That's why he got rid of Rex Tillerson, right? And he knows that Pompeo, that he hopes is going to get confirmed, is very much in alignment with his thinking about the Iran deal. But without an alternative way of getting into Afghanistan, you're not going to see any change in US policy towards Pakistan. And so you're essentially imposing a choice upon the United States, right, which neither choice has outcomes that are terribly preferable for India, right? If we leave Afghanistan, we know exactly what's going to happen, right? We're going to be pretty much where we were on September 10th, 2001 at some point in the future. But if we continue staying on in Afghanistan, we have to continue placating Pakistan, right? And so this is the geographical puzzle that we're in. And at least Obama, when he left office, gave us some hope that we would have a potential future to stay in Afghanistan that would allow us to mitigate our dependence upon Pakistan. But in the short term, and by short term, I actually could mean a decade, or I could mean a year, is, because you never know what Trump is going to tweet and then what he's going to have the rest of his liquor cabinet come up with a supporting policy. But if we're going to stay in Afghanistan, this is going to be the logistical constraint that we confront. I don't see anything that can really change that. The other thing that is very depressing, I think, from a point of view of a South Asianist, because we've been saying this forever, Pakistan is essentially engaging in nuclear coercion, right? Pakistan has now for many decades concluded that since it has an army that cannot win a war, that the only way it can try to put pressure on India is by using jihadists under the umbrella of its ever-expanding nuclear, under the ever-expanding nuclear umbrella, which is, you know, better than most. It now includes tactical, or perhaps more appropriately called battlefield nuclear weapons. The brilliance of Pakistan's strategy is that it is unfailing, right? Whenever there's a terrorist attack here in India, Indians think really long and hard about what might be the look of the escalation ladder, right? It has been a very effective strategy at deterring India from punishing Pakistan for any of its terrorist actions. Now, one of the things that I find very bizarre, as someone who's been watching this region for some time, I all the time hear Indians say, but Pakistan has nuclear weapons. I've never heard a Pakistani say, oh, but India has nuclear weapons. Why is that, right? Presumably, the very same structures of deterrence that allow Pakistan to engage in these activities with impunity also allow India to pursue subconventional options. And this is something I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. I hear a lot of conversations here in South Asia, particularly in India, about conventional and nuclear deterrence. I don't hear any conversations happening about subconventional deterrence. And in fact, whenever this comes up, Indians seem to think that this is something that India is incapable of doing. Well, if you're incapable of doing it, why do you have RAW at all? Are you paying them to eat dosas, for crying out loud? No, I say this not to be a jerk, but this is what intelligence agencies are supposed to do. So in thinking about full spectrum deterrence, you must consider subconventional deterrence. This is not provocative in my way of thinking, this is just called logical. So thinking about the Pakistan puzzle, let's pretend that we could put ourselves outside of the logistical trap, and we could somehow convince policymakers, particularly in Washington, that Pakistan is not too dangerous to fail. You would still, I submit to you, have a lot of difficulty getting anyone to sign up to do anything that's different. And why is that? Because at the end of the day, what is the American politician's worst fear? That there be another 9/11 commission report. It won't be called 9/11. It might be called, 10-3 commission report, in which we have a scenario where the Americans have withdrawn aid from Pakistan, and we've lost our influence, we've lost our access, and a jihadist manages to get nuclear materials, weapons, and what have you, and the worst case scenario actually fructifies, right? So from the point of view of a risk-averse politician, they will do anything to avoid that outcome. And by the way, your politicians are no different from mine. I think it's kind of funny, and I don't mean funny in a humorous way, I mean funny as in this is really insane, that India wants the United States to declare Pakistan to be a state sponsor of terror. Has your government done that yet? Why not? I mean, you're the most direct victim of their terror, and you can't get your parliamentarians to declare the state to be a state sponsor of terror. Well, imagine the difficulty that my politicians are in. So what would it take, right? What kind of Pakistani outrage would it take to knock an American legislator out of this pocket of fear and insouciance? Well, the analogy that I give, if you were in DC 10 years ago, we actually used to have parking meters, right? So the way it would work, you put a quarter in, and if the thing worked, you got a parking space for 15 minutes. If the parking meter didn't work, maybe you got no minutes at all. So many people think of Pakistan as like a broken parking meter. You put a quarter in, you're supposed to get 15 minutes, maybe you'll get 1. But it's a predictable broken meter that Pakistan is going to be a marginal satisfier. If you completely change the policy, you put a quarter in, and maybe you'll get negative 60 minutes, right? So the risk-averse policymaker is always going to err on the side of the status quo because they think that they can manage the status quo. Now, the problem with this is that your average policymaker, particularly in the House of Representatives, they're there for 2 years. And so their horizon is incredibly short, right? And then towards the end of that 2 years, they're already thinking about their next campaign. And then, of course, the term in the Senate's quite a bit longer. It's 6 years. But you have this constant churn, this constant electoral cycle that comes up every 2 years. And this makes it really difficult from an organizational point of view to ever get a critical mass of people that want to do something different. And this is on the legislative side itself. Leave aside the turbulence that happens on the administration side, you know, with the person who's actually occupying the White House. And, you know, when you kind of go through what else can Pakistan do, you come up fairly stumped, right? We had bin Laden, who was hanging out, just a leisurely stroll from Kabul. 9/11, right? Most of 9/11's, you know, most of the planning of 9/11 had a very strong Pakistani footprint. And none of this is really enough to get people to think differently. So one of the things that I think our job as scholars, whether we're in the academy, whether we are in think tanks, is to really educate our leadership to think differently about this problem, right? So I would say that Pakistan is the most stable instability. This idea that Pakistan is on the brink of collapse, the brink of failure, is actually what gives Pakistan so much purchase over us. But if we could convince the average policymaker, and this is a very big if, that Pakistan is not likely to fail, that in fact you can do a lot to that country. It's like when I was a kid, we had this toy called the Weeble. The Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. Pakistan is like a Weeble to me. Whether you're looking at the 1971 war, in which it loses half of its population, look at the 2010 floods, various things that people have said would presage Pakistan's demise, hasn't even had a dent on Pakistan. The place literally should be self-destructing if the pundits were correct, but they're not correct. The place is very stable. So what would it look like? What would a policy towards Pakistan look like if we could convince our policymakers to be more risk acceptant? Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is remove ourselves from Pakistan's coercion loop. And ultimately, how do we do that? Well, it's surprisingly simple to this simpleton's mind. That is, we say to Pakistan, we're no longer going to try to arrogate to ourselves the ability to keep an eye on your nuclear problem. Quite frankly, if the Americans are going to tell me that this $34 billion has brought us access and influence, my response to that is you can keep this influence because under our watch and on our dime, they've proliferated their arsenal of nuclear weapons. Without this infusion of American funds, and money is fungible, $34 billion, I don't think Pakistan would be the rapid proliferator that it is today, right? So I would argue that the American taxpayer, i.e. me, has underwritten the very tools by which Pakistan coerces us. So we have to get ourselves out of that coercion loop before we would be in a position to impose any costs upon Pakistan that are truly meaningful. I think the easiest way to do that is say, look, we know what your nuclear signature is, which in some ways we do to a first order approximation. And if any nefarious individual gets a hold of and uses your materials, we're going to hold you responsible. I think it would also be very useful to say that if Pakistan is the first user of nuclear weapons, that the victim is not going to be responding on their own. I think this is the kind of declaratory policy where we basically say, whatever happens, it's your problem, and you're going to be held responsible.
Christian,
Yeah.
we'll need some time for the question answer.
Yeah, I am. And so let me just fast forward. So let's pretend that we could actually do this. What would some of these sanctions look like? Well, I'm going to submit to you, and we can detail them, we can talk about them. None of those sanctions are going to matter, right? None of the sanctions that the US can actually impose upon Pakistan is going to change its behavior. The only thing that I think the United States has, and that's its sway at the IMF, right? Because right now what Pakistan does whatever it wants to do. The army gets whatever part of the budget it wants, and it relies upon an IMF bailout. And even though it never lives up to its own obligations under the IMF, the United States still tells the IMF to issue another tranche because it's too dangerous to fail. So I would submit to you that the only thing that we could really do to Pakistan that would in any way impose costs associated with this behavior is to withdraw support from the IMF. And in closing, let me make a very strong argument that if we don't do this, we will be picking up the bill of Pakistan's misadventures with China, right? So Pakistan says we don't need you, we've got China. Well, that's also called nonsense, because Pakistan doesn't give grant aid, it gives loan aid. And all Pakistan has to do is look at Hambantota, right? China is the one that's making money off of this, right? China will derive most of the benefit. What Pakistan will get is probably some suboptimal infrastructure. But the worst case scenario is Gwadar is basically like Hambantota. So if the Americans don't cut the Pakistanis off from the IMF, the American taxpayer is actually going to be subsidizing Pakistan's loan servicing to the Chinese. So I'm going to leave that there. So it's not a, it's not a very upbeat assessment, but I'm not known for being upbeat. But I think this is the only thing that we have that could possibly change Pakistan's behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That's been very candid. That is very candid, very good. But the tunnel is long. I now have the honor to request Ambassador Abu Samad Khaidarov, who represents a country which has successfully tackled terrorism. IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, was a big threat. Nomangani and Yuldashov were dreaded words in Uzbekistan and from Afghanistan, where they were based for some time. But today, Uzbekistan is peaceful. Does the resurgence of Taliban worry you? And your rich experience in Afghanistan, does it offer some hope that maybe Uzbekistan's experience can be replicated in Afghanistan? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for providing this opportunity to share my views on the current state of radical organizations AFPAC region. And answering shortly to your question about the hope, yes, there is always a hope that the situation will be improved, and that's why we are here, in order to achieve these goals. According to General John Nicholson, commander of the NATO Resolute Support Mission and the US Force Afghanistan, of 98 US designated terrorist groups globally, 20 are in the AFPAC region. This is the highest concentration anywhere in the world, and you, Mr. Chairman, just 2 minutes ago confirmed these figures. Among these terrorist and militant organizations active in the region, the following are of particular note: ISIL Khorasan, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban movement, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, and Lashkar-e-Taiba. The top two organizations of concern for General Nicholson are the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. These two have transnational ambitions. Further commenting the situation in Afghanistan, General stated that more radicalized elements of other groups ready to join the Islamic State for two reasons. One, they may agree with the ideology, or two, the money. There is direct financial support flowing from Syria to Afghanistan. An Islamic State fighter is paid almost twice as much as a Taliban fighter. Most recently, the proximity of Central Asia to areas of Afghanistan that ISIL-Khorasan has come to control has rendered it vulnerable to potential ISIL-Khorasan infiltration efforts and attacks. Moreover, the government and civil society institutions and underdeployment, poverty, corruption, and illiteracy in Afghanistan are, it is believed, contribute to terrorist and extremist organizations, including ISIL-Khorasan's development in Afghanistan and the region. Despite measures being undertaken by regional countries, according to some sources, there are now approximately 3,000 people from Central Asian republics fighting as a part of ISIL in the Middle East. Pertaining to the number of nationals fighting for ISIL, the following countries claim these respective figures: Tajikistan, 400, Kyrgyzstan, 300, 3,500, Turkmenistan, approximately 300, and Kazakhstan, 250. After defeat in the war in Syria, many of these fighters will try to come back to the Central Asia and Afghanistan to join the ranks of ISIL-Khorasan fighters. Estimates of the number of ISIL-Khorasan fighters in Afghanistan vary widely. And General John Nicholson, commander of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan, estimated between 1,000 and 1,500 fighters. Pentagon estimated 3,000 fighters. My interlocutors in Afghanistan estimate the strength of ISIL-Khorasan in the country to be approximately 7,000, 9,000 fighters. British sources estimate 10,000 fighters as of December 2017. Russia also estimates 10,000 fighters. The exact number of Central Asian citizens in the ranks of ISIL-Khorasan is not known. Currently, it appears that ISIL-Khorasan remains largely regional in nature, but not entirely so. For the time being, ISIL-Khorasan presence remains mostly limited to Nangarhar, Kunar, and Juzjan provinces, and the local population and the majority of Taliban resent ISIL presence. Having said that, we shouldn't underestimate ISIL-Khorasan's capacity to recruit fighters from the population or form alliances with elements of Taliban and other militant groups. There are also credible reports that ISIL-Khorasan presence in a larger number of provinces than this. As for the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, according to some estimates, there are more than 1,000 fighters in the ranks of IMU. According to information obtained from the meetings with a number of people from provinces where these terrorist groups are most active, their current success is based on the following main elements. First of all, of course, it's well-organized information outreach to local communities and recruitment process. Well-established network of madrasas in their area of operation. Clearly defined objectives of their struggle. Financial support to their fighters. Salaries of foot fighters are higher than Afghan National Security Forces and Taliban salaries and wages. Well-organized logistical support and good military equipment. Poverty and unemployment, which are common but to a variable degree in Central Asian countries and Afghanistan, should also be considered as one of the major factors contributing to radicalization of people in this vast region. This is despite some overarching research findings to the contrary. In addition, the collapse of the Soviet Union and emergence of the independent states in Central Asia, along with the commencement of the process of democratization in these republics, provided a good opportunity for people to travel and the spread of different ideologies, including radical ones. Central Asia countries and Afghanistan are endeavoring to resist radicalization occurring on their soil, but each country has its own specifics and different capacities to militate and fight against this. Using this opportunity, I would like to share with you recent Uzbekistan experience with regard to combating extremism and its ideology. As is well known, all Central Asian countries, from the beginning of their independence, started to undertake strong measures against extremism and terror groups to ensure security and sustainable development in their countries. The legislation in this area has been tightened. A tough approach and pressure tactics in relation to this complicated issue in Uzbekistan started to change when Shavkat Mirziyoyev came to power, initially as acting president in September and later as elected president in December 2016. As he stated, the most important task is to fight for the minds of people, especially young people. All Islamic institutions and other relevant institutions now are obliged to explain the true nature of Islam, especially to the young generation, in order to prevent them to join different radical organizations. Thus, the President demonstrated a new approach toward issues related to restraining extremism and the role of religion in enlightening people, especially youth, that constitutes about 60% of population of the Central Asian region and significantly exceeds world average figures. Having said this, it doesn't mean that there is a complete and full denial of necessary forceful measures against violent extremism and terrorism. Consecutively, implementing the new approach, about 17,000 citizens of Uzbekistan who previously occurred in the ranks of the religious extremist and terrorist organizations came out from under the influence of these sects and returned to normal life, according to the President of Uzbekistan. Recently, the Center for the Study of the Public Opinion of Uzbekistan, Ijtimai Fikr, published the results of a survey related to the policy of the government in this sphere. These showed that 90.1% of people positively appreciate the policy in the sphere of religion. Summarizing this short overview of the new trend in the policy with regard to combating extremism, it should be noted that the government of Uzbekistan started large-scale work in order to bring to the public an inevitable spiritual heritage of great thinkers through enlightenment and improvement of education, coupled with rise of living standards of people. All institutions are being encouraged to take more responsibility for the enlightened education of people, especially youth. It appears that Uzbek experience would be useful for those countries facing similar problems in combating violent extremism. So in here, responding to your, I am finishing, yes. Responding to your question about the current situation in Afghanistan, I would like to say that unfortunately, situation still remains very volatile. And you can see and observe different scale clashes and fightings in different provinces of Afghanistan. If you remember, in 2015, Kunduz Provincial Center, Kunduz city was captured by Taliban. In 2016-17, very tense situation was in Badakhshan. Currently, the same tough and serious situation in Farah city. But of course, government of Afghanistan is undertaking necessary measures in order to control this situation. And shortly about the recent efforts of Afghan government with regard to combating extremism. One can see that Afghan leadership is consistently trying to undertake concerted efforts to combat extremism and to enter into cooperation with neighboring countries and international organizations in efforts to ensure security inside the country. Indeed, particularly through strengthening its security forces. At the same time, national unity government is trying to find peaceful measures. For example, to talk to the Taliban and other opposing groups. As a result of this approach, Hizb Islami Gulbuddin and its leader has formally joined the peace process. The most recent Kabul conference, held on 28th of February 2018, saw the stated readiness of President Ghani to continue efforts to talk directly to Taliban. His peace plan includes amending the constitution, amnesty for Taliban fighters, recognition of Taliban as a political party, and lifting sanctions on their leaders. However, this is predicated on the Taliban's recognition on the Afghan government. So, just to save our time, I would like to say that all Central Asian countries have a vital interest in a stable Afghanistan. Stability and reduction of extremism activities cannot be achieved without improvement in the education sector, long-term economic growth, strengthened trade relations, and progress in infrastructure developments. Unfortunately, neighboring countries and Afghanistan lack of common strategy to address this issue. Afghanistan needs sustainable economic assistance in order to become stable, safe, and prosperous, and should be seen as a part of solution rather than the problem. With close cooperation between international community and the Afghan government, the threats of extremism and terrorism can be mitigated and regional stability enhanced. We hope the Tashkent Conference on Afghanistan, which is to be held in the end of March, will provide better understanding of this long-lasting crisis and help to find the way towards peace and stability in this region. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There's always a rush for time, but thank you so much for your words. I now have the honor to request Mr. Frederic Grard, head of the division in France, the French Foreign Ministry, dealing with the region. And also because very few countries like France have had the vast experience from the middle of last century especially to now, to dealing with all varieties of terrorism in all its dangerous forms. So I'm sure your words would be very useful.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dogra. I mean, that's only an honor that we would have liked to avoid, but anyway, this is true that we have been dealing with terrorism. But this is not the question here. The question is, how do we find some sort of a vaguely original approach to something which has been discussed at length in the literature and in the previous conversation? I mean, I would like to try to take a slightly more prospective view on what's going on in AFPAC and beyond. I mean, the introduction to this session started in the end of the caliphate in the Levant. That is the end of the territorial control of a significant part of Syria and Iraq. And I think that the question that we have to ask ourselves today is, are we facing today collectively a problem of a different nature in the region as we did before? And there are a number of reasons, whatever the answer, there are a number of reasons to ask this question, as they may help us understand how things could evolve, at least some of these questions. First of all, I'd like to challenge a little bit the assumption under this session, which is that AFPAC is the epicenter of terrorism today. AFPAC remains a very, if not the prime center of for global terror, but this is no longer the only one. And if you have opened up the papers about Southeast Asia last summer, especially about Marawi, there are questions to be asked. And for the very same reason, the return of fighters from ISIS to the region. I mean, what happened in Marawi is not innocent. There were not just people from the region. There were people also coming from the Arabic Peninsula, and that is meaningful of a real globalization. The extent is still to be decided, but nevertheless, this is something. This is in no way an attempt to dilute the importance of AFPAC. This is just a way to say that if you consider that you do have a series of country-to-country relationship between those movements, the problem has increased. And we are facing a problem of almost unprecedented scale. And this scale will by itself raise problems of its own. The second question that it does raise is linked to the very idea which is behind it. Why can we compare Mindanao, for example, in Afghanistan or Pakistan? Because there is the question of territorial control. I mean, there we have the southern Philippine island where the government doesn't exercise any real control and has not done it for years, where there is a real power vacuum, and that's where the insurgency is taking place. And that's where now the returnees are going, right? We are almost in a similar situation in Afghanistan, at least for part of the country, and we are in a much more ambiguous situation, but part of it can be compared to it in Pakistan as well. The question of territorial control is essential for bad guys to regroup, refund, reorganize, replan. So this is not something which is unimportant. In Pakistan, of course, the question is to stop the country from being used for as a sanctuary. And there we have had the discussion about the US policy. I'm not going to go into that again, but this is very much what is at stake right now. I think that some of the challenges that Chris has highlighted are very true, and I do share them. And in Afghanistan, of course, the goal is to prevent the country to become again a sanctuary. I mean, will it be successful? This is already questionable for a number of reasons. This is not the 4% that are mentioned in the introductory booklet. This is much more than is actually being controlled by the Taliban today. So the question is very much there. The question of territorial control also raised directly and indirectly the issue of what will be the relationship between the various organizations in the future. I mean, in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, post-Soviet withdrawal and so on, there was one question which was haunting academic circles and policy-making circles alike. Are we facing something like an Islamic Comintern, which suppose both a convergence of objective and a chain of command? And by and large, the answer was no. We knew what the process was. I mean, aspiring terrorists from almost every country would come to this specific country because there was a power vacuum, and then would regroup, retrain, refund, blah, 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 go back to their own cause and fight again. But there was no real unity, even though there were eventually common ideologies and convergence occasionally. Today we can ask the same question, and we will partly arrive at the same answer, with one major difference, though, that in between we have had the creation of two organizations with global aspiration. One being Al-Qaeda, of course, and one being Daesh. Now, why do I say that the question of territorial control matters in this context? Simply because the big difference between Daesh and Al-Qaeda was about territorial control. Now, with the caliphate gone, I mean, the idea of the caliphate itself has changed. This is much less for Daesh an earthy matter. The word is still used, but it's used in a very different thing, right? So are we likely to see some sort of rapprochement between Daesh and Al-Qaeda? Again, there is no answer, but this is a question which is worth asking because you see two very different situations. If you look at Southeast Asia, then you do have situations where Al-Qaeda and Daesh actually cooperate. If you look at Afghanistan, you do have Al-Qaeda acting on its own and regrouping, refunding, everything, but acting on its own. Now, what you do have in Afghanistan is the same question of territoriality being asked about the relation between Daesh and the Taliban. And there we have no single answer either, because we do have situations where the two fight each other for the control of resources and power, and we do have situations where they do actually cooperate. Now, I see the criticism coming. It was expressed by Mr. Hemmatullah yesterday, which say, well, this is all the same thing. This is a way to convince the international community that the Taliban are a more acceptable force than Daesh. And I sympathize partly with the argument. I think there is absolutely every reason to believe that within that game, like in every single game in South Asia, there is manipulation by the usual suspect. You take the kind of affiliation that you see going from TTP to Daesh, and vice versa, by the way, occasionally. You take LEG, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, moving to Daesh, and interestingly, of course, fighting the usual sectarian thing, but also you fighting Baluch separatists in Balochistan. And then you start asking, at the very least, what's going on there. So I won't go any further for in order to remain vaguely diplomatic, but I think these are real questions. But I mean, the question is still a valid one for another reason. The question is still a valid one because, as Ambassador just said, you do have a number of returnees from other nationalities as well. And whatever their future, whether they get involved into the local group, and that's very much a possibility because nobody arrives in Afghanistan or elsewhere in a vacuum. You arrive in a place where there is already sort of a jihadi landscape, which has been said by previous far. And therefore, you adapt to it your own way, in different way, in a confrontational way or in a cooperative one, but I mean, you do have to adjust to the reality of the country. So we may well face a situation where those returnees will actually fight other people's battle. That too was the rule in the 90s. You paid whatever you due was for having been sheltered by whatever group was sheltering you by fighting alongside them for a while before going back to your own country. So we may face the same kind of situation, but I mean, we may face also a number of other situations. What I'm trying to say is that kind of relation, if you take out the manipulation component, which is very much there, I insist on that, but which is definitely not unique, then you may face a very fluid and very different situation in a few years from now, or even in a few months from now. So I think that's a question which is worth asking. Now I'd like to go to another element which very much goes in the same direction Professor Dorsey was going this morning. When you do have groups basically acting within the same ideological matrix, does ideology matters anymore? What we see here is a great deal of fight, of greed and lust for power, and nothing else in many cases. So I don't think we should be too focused on those ideological questions, because once you have said that, well, this is all Wahhabi and Salafis and wah, then what do you say? And how does that help you, really? What this idea of counter-narrative is for? Not much, actually. For a number of sociological as well as very practical questions. I mean, we are not facing theology and arguing all the time for whatever idea is most fashionable right now. We're facing a reality where balance of power on the ground actually decide the affiliations. I mean, part of the seduction of Daesh, for example, be it in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or elsewhere, was linked to the narrative of victory. But in this narrative of victory, victory was much more important than the ideology which was supposed to rationalize behind. So that's something which I believe is important as well. Now, I've mentioned already the relations with the Taliban. I mentioned this. I won't be any longer because we are already close to the end of the session. Let me just conclude by one thing. And again, I will concur with Professor Dorsey, which is, you know, it's no coincidence if the countries most affected by terrorism today, or contributed the most to terrorism today, because of course you all have Pakistan in mind, are the least democratic in the region, right? It doesn't mean that democracy itself is a guarantee against terrorism. I mean, I come from a country which pretends to be democratic, and yet we have been affected by terrorism in a big way in recent times. Well, the question is really that different. First of all, democratic country tends to be more resilient, providing it's both democratic and pluralistic. So the preservation of that is something important. Second, what we see in the variety of situations that we can observe all over Asia, for example, is that it's ultimately linked to a number of local political situations. So a political answers to political problems, which are themselves the reason of the frustration of a number of people joining ISIS and so on, is perhaps a prerequisite. Ideologues you will always have of whatever kinds. But I mean, and we can probably not eradicate political violence there too, I agree with you, sir. But it can be contained, providing we do accept to address the problem as they are and the nature of problems that we have to address. And I will stop on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There was a lot of intellectual content to what all you said, and some amount of worry that we've hardly dealt with Daesh, that they have a new form now coming in Afghanistan, close to India, close to the region. So the problems are many, and I'm sure the questions would be many. There are already hands going up. May I request that please address your question to one member of this panel, and please name that member so that he or she could answer your question.
My question is to Professor Christine Fair. I was just sitting outside, ma'am, having a cup of tea, and I saw a tweet which complimented you for good old plain speak. My question is very simple, and hence may appear naive in view of geopolitical dynamics. If there is such a great consensus among all the major powers, France, Germany, US, everywhere, everybody, India, that Pakistan is the hotbed of militancy, and it is using its influence, twisting the arms. What deters US from exiting Afghanistan and thereby calling the bluff of Pakistan? Thank you.
Hold on, I actually didn't understand what's preventing the United States from leaving Afghanistan? Well, nothing prevents the United States from leaving Afghanistan. I think that there is a consensus, a very slender consensus, that it's in the US interest to stay in Afghanistan. There is in the United States a lot of debate about whether or not the US has compelling interests in Afghanistan. Trump, during his campaign, he argued that he's going to pull us out of Afghanistan. And once he became elected, he argued exactly the opposite. I don't think there's anything keeping the United States in Afghanistan except some fairly significant thread of argumentation amongst national security elites that it's our interest. So that's not the question. And there's nothing about calling Pakistan's bluff either, when it comes to Afghanistan. My point in making this play, it's simply about logistics. And what Trump has done is that he has undone the progress of the previous administration in terms of Iran, right? So had Hillary Clinton won the presidency, we would potentially be in a different position. So for example, most of what we're moving through Pakistan's ground lines of communications are supplies for the Afghan National Security Forces. So things like uniform. Let's say India able to do two things: create an alternative channel that makes Pakistan less able to extract rents, while also consolidating a really important relationship with India. Does that answer your question? I took my entire length of my presentation time to explain to you how, I don't know whether you're French, German, Indian, or American, policymakers care about one thing. I mean legislators. They care about one thing: getting through their term without a scandal and getting reelected, right? There's nothing, if you think about what a congressperson does or a member of the Lok Sabha does in the course of their day, none of this incentivizes them to think big about a problematic country, right? They're all risk averse. And that means that the default position is going to be the status quo. I mean, you hear exhaustion in my voice. I've been arguing for containment, for compellence, for now 15 years, right? And only in the last year or so have people begun agreeing with me. And I'm like, well, better late than never. But it doesn't matter, because the people that we elect are not going to think big about this issue. They have no reason to. And I'm going to argue that your politicians have the exact same structural constraints as ours. And so this isn't geopolitics. This is local election winning issues. Bus.
Thank you, Chair. Two short questions. One for Christiani, one for Frederick. Frederick. Christiani, you mentioned the subconventional deterrence to be exercised by India. Wonder if you would explain it a little bit more as to how that would be effective. Frederick, you are right that territory is a critical issue. But then what is the answer to this territory? Because for almost more than 2-3 decades, in Afghanistan, international forces have been fighting on the territory question, and they just could not make any headway. So what is the answer? The question is right. What is the answer to the territory puzzle?
So would you like to start?
Yes, Frederick. No, go ahead.
Well, the question of territorial control. Well, in Afghanistan, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the diagnostic is there, the answer is not there. You will probably have noticed also that I spoke of containing the problem and that we could not pretend to eradicate it. That's probably also what is behind the US decision to stay with a minimal number of forces. Actually, what the Trump administration has decided is absolutely no different from what was being discussed at the end of the Obama administration. So basically, the administration goes on with figures that were already discussed. The idea is not to probably totally reconquer the country, but at least preserve whatever can be preserved, reorganize whatever can be reorganized so that the Afghan government can gradually, if things go on, properly reconquer territory over time, but I will certainly agree with you that this is a very uncertain proposal, right? So preserving the regime is one step and one necessary step. Doing whatever is required politically to create some sort of a new situation where perhaps the military will have less emphasis and the political side more is another one. What I see today is a minimal action doing in the military side, but properly done as far as I can observe at least, and nothing really meaningful done on the political side. I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that it's likely to succeed in any case, but this is something which will have to be considered. Is that uncertain? Yes, it is. I'm sorry. I mean, I have no magic bullet. Otherwise, I'll probably be a rich man by now. And I guarantee it's not. But no, you're right. I mean, there is no absolute solution, but there is certainly ways to contain things. I mean, the fact is we have wasted 10 years, right? And wasted a lot of time, money, blood for not much. If we go by what the dynamic that Chris was describing, we may end up in some time from now in the same situation that we are in 9/11. But I mean, there are probably things that can, at least reduce the risk, mitigate it, create a situation which is not as dire as it was pre-9/11, and perhaps if things go well, and if we're lucky as well, then help turn the situation back.
So, you know, on the political side of this, I'm also exhausted, as exhausted as I am with the Pakistanis. And I am just put me in charge of the drone program. Just give me 2 weeks, 2 friggin' weeks. But as frustrated as I am, I'm equally frustrated with the Afghans, right? We know from the insurgency literature that this insurgency could not thrive as it has if the Afghan government cleaned up its act. It's just a statement of fact. You know, Ghani, he ran an institute on fixing failed states. So in principle, he understands what he should be doing. And this national unity government isn't anything like a national unity government. It's not even a government. So as an American who's a taxpayer, and we're primarily paying Afghanistan's bills, it becomes increasingly difficult to argue to the taxpayer, and going again to the people that we're electing, to keep staying in Afghanistan when we see Afghanistan's elites being very corrupt, being very enriched, and not doing what they need to do to make Afghanistan more governable. And I would say the other issue that we haven't talked about at all, because if we think Pakistan is a challenge and we think Afghan governance is a challenge, we haven't talked remotely about what does it mean for Afghanistan to be fiscally sustainable. It can't even pay its recurring costs. This government must be downsized, and how do you downsize a government while fighting an insurgency? And for this, I blame my own country, right? The United States insisted upon building this mega rentier state. It's never existed at this size, at this level of rentierness. So even if we had a magical wand that could fix aspects of the insurgency and corruption, this idea of making Afghanistan pay for itself is very, very challenging. And it's even more challenging if we think about it without China. And this is an obvious source of frustration for the Indians. But what Afghanistan needs, it needs an internal system of transport. It needs investors to get minerals out of the ground, and it needs to get those minerals to market. And there's really only one country that cares so little about the safety of its own workers, and that's China. Who else is going to do it? You're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. So it really is I don't know when we're going to hit the bottom, but it's a bottomless set of intractable problems. And again, the policymakers' time horizon is completely disconsonant with the timelines that we actually need to think about these issues.
Please.
This is for Mr. Gair. Hello?
This is for Mr.?
For Mr. Greer. There was, throughout this conference since yesterday, there has been some recognition of the fact that the Daesh exit or end has been prematurely celebrated. Is very much there. So I was wondering if you could tell us about the stories we hear about Daesh fighters being given a safe corridor out of Syria, and then they are somehow being safe landed in Europe. What are the European countries doing about this? That would affect your country also. ISIS coming back to Europe.
I don't know what you mean by ISIS coming back to Europe, because if you look at the European situation, you will see that the ISIS problem has a connection, of course, to the situation in Syria and Iraq. But what we see as actors in Europe are not people coming from Syria or Iraq. We see Europeans acting in Europe. So it doesn't mean the connection doesn't exist, it just means that this is of a very different nature. The problem for us, Europeans, is to prevent people from going to Syria and coming back. This is a problem which has been by and large stopped now, and there is a reason why you haven't seen so many attacks recently. I'm not saying that it has disappeared. I'm not saying that the risk is not there, but this has clearly diminished. The other question that you could legitimately ask is why are young Europeans going to and there are a number of reasons behind it. And if there is one thing I slightly disagree with my dear friend Christian is precisely on the fact, I mean, people joining ISIS from Europe were coming from all kinds of social background, not necessarily a deprived background, so there's not a unique social causality behind it. But nevertheless, there is a reality. The roots were, you know, people tend to confuse, both in Europe and here apparently, the question of migration and Daesh. And these are two very different questions. It doesn't mean, of course, that if you accept 1 million people on your territory, there might be 1 or 2 that are probably unsavory, but this is not really the problem. The problem is different. Now, if you speak of the roots, then you end up in the same situation. Countries like Turkey, that Europeans have been so proud of saying that, well, you know, we have an agreement with them, we pay them basically, and they stop the migration problem. Yes. It's also a country which turns a blind eye on many people going back to Iran, Afghanistan, and so on. They turn a blind eye on other directions as well. So, well, there we might have a problem there. And again, you end up with the same situation that you're faced with, countries like Pakistan, who are always ready to help you individually, providing you close your eyes on other issues. So that's where you are. I mean, this is international politics. Is it a dirty game? Yes. That's the rule of the game, by the way, but this is a reality. But please do not confuse this question of migration, which creates a number of problems because there is a cost of adjustment wherever they go, and a political price to pay for it, most of the time, or at the very least a political risk, and the security question which is not linked intimately to it. These are two different issues. They may occasionally, but very occasionally be confused, but they are definitely two very different issues. Now, if you want to avoid those two issues to be confused for good, you precisely make clear in your narrative that they are very different issues. Because the last thing you want is to marginalize people and push them into the arms of much more radical organization.
I think we've run out of time, run far out of time, but I am delighted that I could be associated with a panel as rich as this. We've had a huge number of issues tackled from Daesh in Europe to AFPAC, and in the end I get a sense that ultimately, as that song said in Sound of Music, if you've watched that film, what do you do with a problem called Maria in that song, but what do you do with a problem called Pakistan? I don't know whether we found many answers to that, but some pointers certainly, and thanks to each one of you. Thank you, and thank you, audience.
Thank you everyone for this fantastic discussion. I would request Ambassador Rajiv Dogra to present a token of appreciation on part of the organizers to our speakers, Mr. Christian Wagner. Dr. Christine Fair. Dr. Christine Fair. Ambassador Khaidarov. And Mr. Frederick Grar. I would request our director, Captain Alok Bansal, to present a memento to our chair, Ambassador Rajiv Dogra. Thank you, everyone. Two small announcements. Those of you asking for the book on the proceedings of last year's counterterrorism conference, you can buy them from the counter right outside the hall. They are present there. And second, please tweet and post on Facebook with the hashtag CTC 2018. We'll now break for tea and reconvene at 4:35 for the session on constructing effective counter narratives. Thank you.